Well, I'm sure many of you heard of the author Albert Camus. He's quite famous because he won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and he also wrote several books, one of which was entitled The Plague, that got reread a lot during the pandemic, and I did so too. And he's mainly known as a very famous French writer. However, he probably wouldn't consider himself entirely French. He was indeed a Frenchman, however, who's someone native in Algeria. His children would nowadays say he actually considered himself more Algerian than French. It's not exactly about his identity that I'm going to speak about, but I think it's interesting to look at him in a more contextual manner and also see how him growing up in Algeria shaped his writing, his style, the way he makes sense of the world around him. And the book that I'm going to present to you has a lot of interesting facts about just that. Albert Camus was born in Algeria in 1913 to French and Spanish parents, and actually he lived a very big part of his life in the country. Until 1947, he grew up there, he went to university there, and then later on he also returned several times. He grew up in a working class neighborhood. He was surrounded by the Mediterranean, and that's very much, this surrounding shaped very much his views, but also his political activism later on. And that's most extensively presented in the book Algerian Chronicles. So that's the book. Algerian Chronicles was originally written in French and published in 1958, but only translated entirely into English in 2013. So that's the first translation we have now, which is great, so that now everyone can read it. And there's also a foreword by Alice Kaplan, who's a French professor at university in the US. What is this book about? What's in there? Basically, it consists of journalistic articles that Albert Camus wrote between 1939 and 1958, so over a period of time of around 20 years. The reason why he published it in 1958 was he wanted to kind of correct the different criticism that he got at that time. People were criticizing his view on the Algerian question, and he felt very much misunderstood. So he wanted to make his position a bit more clear and also show that he's been active in Algeria as a journalist for over 20 years, and that the views that he wants to share about the situation back then is grounded also on his experience there. So yeah, the context was a quite particular one, given that it was kind of the beginning of the Algerian War of Independence and also the fall of the Fourth Republic in France. What I'm going to do, because the book, of course, consists of several articles, as I said, is just to present two of them. One that was published more towards the beginning that shows also how his journalistic career started, and the latter one is a bit more advanced in his political views and therefore a bit more advanced in time. Again, little challenge here with the slides. Let me just do it like this. All right, so the first article that I'm going to talk about is The Misery of Kabala. It's a series of 11 articles that he published in 1939 in the newspaper Algerian Républicain, and he published 7 out of them in this book, Algerian Chronicles. It was basically the first time he traveled to that region. Kabala is in the north of Algeria, where mainly Berber people live. And I mean, the time and context he grew up in was mainly colonial, mainly urban. So it was a quite different context that he saw then. And he was quite shocked by the situation that he saw, the poverty, but even the famine that he saw in 1939. So he wrote a quite critical articles that was also quite uncommon and gave him some local fame. He didn't necessarily criticize the colonial system, but more the way it's been done. He, for instance, interviewed people there with a translator because he didn't speak the local language, how much food they had, what their salary was like. And he also tried to unpack some of the stereotypes of the colonial system, like native labor being less valuable than European labor. And yet he was more into a reform approach of the colonial system and less into criticizing the colonial system as such. He was also very touched by seeing the way people lived in the area, because at the same time, people had a lot of dignity, and he was also very impressed by the culture that he saw and the way people, the communal life people had in Kabylia. And that inspired him very much for the philosophy on simplicity that he developed over time in his different fictional books. So I think that's also interesting to see how his journalistic career in his early years shaped the literature and the literature style that he presented later on. The second article I want to share with you is entitled Letter to an Algerian Militant, that was published in 1955 and actually got also published in another newspaper entitled Communauté Algérienne, that was founded by Aziz Kessous, and that's also the addressee of that letter. Aziz was an Algerian member of parliament, however, of a French system parliament, who was advocating for a coexistence between the French and the Algerians in Algeria. And Camus later on very much agreed with that approach and wanted to salute Kessous for that viewpoint and also confirm him in that. And ultimately he said, we are condemned to live together and we need to figure out how we can do that. What I find interesting also about Camus' perspective is the fact that it's the perspective of what we call nowadays a pied noir, so a Frenchman born on Algerian soil, who of course had a bit different views than other people in the country, but it's a perspective that we hear much less about today because it's not the perspective that is continuing today. But it's interesting to see also how Camus' viewpoints evolved, whereas in 1939, it was more about reforming the colonial system. Now his vision for the future of the country has changed quite a lot. And also now the way he's engaging with other Algerians is a different one than in the 1930s. So therefore, I think why you should read this book is, among other reasons, the fact that I think it's a lesser known perspective on his relationship with his native Algeria, because he's mainly known as a French intellectual. And also because you see a lot how his engagement with the country changed over time, and also how that later on, I mean, ultimately shaped his writing and of course also his political activism. It's, as I said also earlier, an interesting perspective of a pied noir in Algeria, which, well, nowadays is not the common perspective to look into, but it's a really interesting testimony of the time of Camus in Algeria. There are, of course, a few more interesting articles that you can look into on that book specifically, but also on his relationship with Algeria, and a few podcasts that you can, of course, listen into if you want to learn more. That's it from my side. Thank you. I'm sure we have time for questions later on if you like, but that's it from me for now.